Remember I said to you a couple of weeks ago now that the series of lectures, the 3 from me and then 2 from Tracy, were moving from a kind of more realist approach to a more constructivist approach. Well, we kind of got halfway there now with narrative. Last week you saw how grounded theory involved a lot of interpretive kind of approaches. Well, that's certainly true of narrative as well, but a lot more focus in narrative now on how language is being used. And in particular, in this case, it's how stories are being told and how the language is used through a story to tell someone what you think about something and what your feelings and what your experiences are. Narrative is a thing, or storytelling perhaps I should say, is a thing that people do naturally all the time anyway. There's nothing peculiar about it. And we'll certainly have a look at some examples of that later on, of how narratives crop up in interviews and so on, and have a look at some of those. To start with, just a few general terms. Narrative, story, the way that social actors, and this is what the focus is on, the way that social actors produce, represent and contextualise their experience and their personal knowledge. How they make sense of what happened. And that's what I mean by contextualise. That they give sense to it. They tell a story both to themselves by telling a story and of course to other people who are listening to it. And that story may also be something they've told many times, that they've repeated many times, or that it may be a version of something they've repeated and told before. So it'll be, in some sense, adapted to the particular context, particular audience in which it's being said. An important point about that is to make sense of what's happened to them. So it's often reflections on things in their own life, things that they've done and so on, and trying in some way to put that into some kind of meaningful context for themselves and for you. Now, of course, in so doing, they do a lot of other things, and I'll be coming back to that later on, some of the other functions of stories, some of the other things that are done when people are telling stories. Just a few other terminology issues. The narrative I've taken as being the wide general term. A narrative is any kind of account, whether it's the whole interview or some small part of interview, in which some kind of story or some kind of explanation of experience is given. Whereas I take story to be restricted to a genre that has these elements in it, these key elements, and I'll come back again later on to talk about what these mean, these key elements. But protagonists, that is to say actors who do things in the story, events, things that happen to those actors or things that the actors do, and complications and consequences. Now, there is a formalistic way of looking at narrative in this kind of way, a story kind of approach, and I use that term there. Where can narratives come from? I've already hinted at this, that they come from straightforward interviews. Well, certainly we can do what's often called a narrative interview, or a very open kind of interview, in which simply you say to somebody, please tell me your story. And then if it works well, you sit back and listen for the next hour or so, and they just tell you their story. I mean, you might contextualise it a bit more about what particular aspect of their life you want them to talk about, but you kind of give an indication at the beginning of a narrative interview that that's what you want to do. You're going to sit back and let them tell it as it is. So this kind of interview is very much an example of a participant-led interview. It's where you let the interviewee, in a sense, determine what they're saying and what comes up and so on, and much less intervention from you determining what issues come up and so on. So whereas in, I think, that was it last term, I talked about an interview schedule or a prompt list, in a sense, for an interview. We have a list of topics you want to talk about. A narrative interview might not have any of that at all. It might just be simply a word at the top, your experience in doing so and so, and that's it, and that's all they can talk about. You can also get narratives out of biographies and even autobiographies. Biographies, basically you ask somebody to tell you about their life, and that can be done in all sorts of ways. Again, rather like a narrative interview, can generate just, so one question at the beginning can generate the whole of the biography. But you might come back with prompts about what happened next and who did what when and so on. Remind people about things they missed out and so on, or things they want to come back to. And the autobiography is simply the person doing it of their own life. In fact, you can use people's autobiography as a form of data in narrative approaches. So people write their own life down, or their autobiography, you can use that. Allied things are things like the life history interview, which is rather like a biographical interview, more often focuses on particular aspects of life. For example, there was a whole series of these done some decades ago now of people's experience of wartime Britain. So the life history of what was life like in the war, so that period, and the life history interview, often accompanied by things like photographs to jog people's memory and so on. And then they come out with stories basically about what went on. But you can even go to the extent of looking at things like personal letters, diaries and so on, if they're detailed enough to give you that kind of sense of telling stories. It depends partly on what people write in their letters and in their diaries. If they tell stories, fine, but not everyone writes letters and diaries in that way. Anyway, so a whole host of sources for narrative data. It has to be said that most of the time, for most researchers doing narrative research, it's the interviews that is the main source. But don't forget about the other sources as well. Just to mention some names of theorists here, there are a whole load of these, lots of people working in this area, but these are ones you will probably come across in reading the background literature. Norman Denzin, in fact they're all American, I'm going to say he's American, they're all American, all three of them American. Or is Reisman Canadian? Anyway, North American, put it like that, they're all from North America. Norman Denison, actually quite well known for his work on triangulation. That was done some decades ago, before he got interested in narrative accounts and so on. He talked about triangulation. But in more recent years, he's been much more interested in a very constructivist approach towards narrative and narrative analysis. And Denison suggests that we see the narrative as a story with a sequence of events, things happening one after the other. And those sequences or those events are of significance for the narrator and the audience. So things are mentioned because they have some kind of meaning. Not just because they happened, of course they happened, but they're mentioned as having happened because they have some sort of significance as an event affected the narrator, and something that the narrator wants to tell the audience about. There's a reason why they mention it. If you think about it, if you tell the story of what happened to you, even just a short period of your life, you could spend month after month talking about it. But of course, you haven't got that time. You've got just an hour to tell it. So you select things. There are things that you pick out. Now, what are those things, and why do you pick them out? And that's what the narrative analyst is interested in. Why have you chosen those things? Why are you highlighting those sequences and those events? And what does it mean to you, the person, and to the audience to whom you're speaking? Denison also points out that stories tend to have middles, beginnings, and end, and a logic to them. I'll come back to this with some more examples of this in just a moment. But stories start somewhere. There is normally a setting up of stories, setting out the characters, the place where things happen, and so on. And then there's a middle when things get going and events happen and so on. And normally there's some kind of ending, which can be upbeat or downbeat. It can be a kind of lesson learned or whatever, something that kind of unifies the narrative. And gives a logic to it as well. And again, I'll talk about the logic of these things. Importantly, he suggests narratives have a temporal causal sequence. The whole point about telling a story is that one thing leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. And that's what the person's saying. When the person tells a story, they're telling you that event led, for them, that event led to that event and led to that thing, and that led to them doing this and so on. Things happened in this kind of order. And they were important, that they happened like that and happened to me and so on. So there's a kind of causal sequence in the story. Catherine Kuller-Reisman, who's written a nice little short text for Sage on narrative, and Elliot Mishler, who I think probably one of the originators of this approach. He wrote a lot about medical contexts and the telling of stories by patients and so on. That's become quite a large area of narrative research now, looking at people who've suffered illnesses and traumas and disablements and so on, and talking about their experiences. Reisman points out in one of her books that actually even in straightforward research interviews, people often break into stories. And we'll actually look at two examples of that in the exercise later on. So looking at where people suddenly start to tell a story about something when they're answering a more general question. And again, there's a natural inclination to do that for us, to tell stories. We like telling stories, and we like to hear things done that way. Okay, well, just to put a bit of context and a bit of structure on this, I've gone to a book by Lieblich and colleagues who identified these 4 types of narrative and life history. And they classify them by whether the focus is on the content or the form. So is it the actual meaningful content of the narratives we're looking at, or is it the structure, the form, if you like, or the structure of the story? Or is it looking at a whole story, or is it looking at parts, categorising bits of the story? So this is looking at the whole narrative in one large chunk, and this is looking at bits of it and how the thing might develop in parts. Okay, let's look at what those mean then. So first of all, let's look at the holistic content. So this is number 1. This looks at the complete life story. It's holistic, so it's the whole story of the person. And perhaps it's familiar from things like clinical studies, the history of a patient. I mean, certainly if you think of things like the classic psychiatric case studies of Freud and so on, these are kind of holistic narratives. We can use fairly familiar qualitative methods to identify key themes. In other words, you can do the thematic analysis that we talked about last week in grounded theory and in previous weeks to look at it. It's it's a story in a large sense, and we can look at thematic ideas within it, say Lieblich et al. And we can look at things like transitions between themes. That may be an important part of the narrative, that things go from one situation to another situation. We can look at where that happens. Again, narratives are very often told chronologically. That is, the story starts in the past and gradually comes up to date in order, in chronological order. And so we can look for where things change, the transitions from that to that, when that person changed from being a so-and-so to being a so-and-so. In fact, people often talk about it that way. Before then I was doing this, and then I changed and did this. Or before that I was this kind of person, and now I'm this kind of person, and so on. So transitions can be often important ideas to look for. But we can also look for episodes. This is, given that it's a chronological sequence of things happening, an episode can happen at some stage that doesn't necessarily fit in. It can be in some way an outlier or unusual or uncommon for that person and their narrative. And there might be some reason why it's there. Some contrast is being given by the person. That's why they're including that. Or they're surprised by it, and they're surprised that they overcome it and change things despite the fact that it was different from all the other situations. So particularly ones that contradict themes in terms of content, mood or evaluation by the narrator can be an interesting things to look at. And even pay attention to the issues that are not mentioned. In fact, that came up, I think, we were talking about the line-by-line coding, that there were things that weren't mentioned. Somebody said that to me, which were interesting, that it wasn't talked about. And when someone's telling you a story, if they leave something out, you can pretty well assume that that's intentional. They've got the chance to include it if they want to, but they hadn't included it. So why haven't they included it? It might just be that they don't think it's that important, but there might be other reasons too why they've not included things. So, your expectations of what should be in a story, the story of a life, for example, if you talk about, to a young person about their educational experience in the country, well, you'd expect them to talk about things like school and college and so on. But if they don't do that, if they don't talk about those things, what's going on? Why have they left them out? What are they telling you by leaving things out of the story that you might expect to be in there? Now, there's nothing necessarily sinister about leaving things out. There might be good reasons why they've left them out, but nevertheless, it is an interesting question to ask. Why does that narrative take that form? Lieblich et al. Suggests various typical themes of people's whole life story. And here are some of them they give. The relational story, in which the person's constantly referring to others. You might actually call it the envy story. I'm not like so-and-so, I'm like this. Lady so-and-so, I did this, that sort of thing. or unlike my brother, I did this, etc., etc. You know, and you can see a contrast with somebody else who is set up as someone who achieved what I didn't achieve, or someone who, you know, was a wastrel and I actually did things and so on. But a contrast is made with other people. So the relational story often does it. Maybe not just one person, maybe several people in the story overall. But that's how they are portraying themselves, as different or similar to the others in the relational story. Stories can be about belonging and separateness, about, you know, being part of something, being part of the family is a common one, being part of the community, and so on, or separateness, being divorced from that, being somehow taken away from it. And you often get this coming up, people talking about migration, or migrants, people who've moved from one place to another, whether that's, you know, just simply within their own country or from one country to another. We'll often talk about those kinds of things, about not belonging or belonging, finding a new belonging, finding separateness or not, and so on as they've moved. You also get it here with closeness and remoteness, the experience of moving. This can be just simply of things like, you know, occupational mobility, moving from one town to another, and you get those kinds of issues coming up. A very common core of a story is the vocation. A lot of people define themselves, and when they talk about themselves, talk a lot about their occupation, the job they do. They see it as vocation in a sense, not just a job they're doing, but a vocation. And that becomes the central life theme for their stories. Other things that come up, obviously relations with opposite sex or not, as the case may be, and you might say, well, why aren't they mentioning it if they don't mention it, and why are they if they are mentioning it? You know, the issues, similar issues come up. Another, I mean, following the psychologist Adler, a focus on early life. Again, a common theme that people come up with here is the idea of I'm like I am now because of what happened to me in the past. You know, my childhood experiences have done this, that, the other, or my first marriage was such that I now am so and so and so. That kind of relationship back, that kind of relating back to the things that happened earlier on in their life that they now pick up. Okay, so that's number one. That's the content holistic. Let's go on to the form.
So Graham,
yeah.
Before you continue,
Yeah.
You know how you mentioned that within that holistic context you can use different types of analysis. So is this approach, this narrative approach, is that a certain way of looking at the data? It's not a type of analysis.
It is a bit of both. It's quite complicated, and it's interesting if you already picked up on that as a kind of ambiguity, because for some people it is a form of analysis. And you can use a very kind of discursive kind of approaches to analysing data, which pick up a lot of things I'll be bringing up later on to do with narrative structure that come up as well. So you can see it as a way of analysing stories that's different from coding. And what those people tend to emphasise is the focusing on one person's story. So they're looking at the individual and how they see the world rather than comparing across cases. So what's common to grounded theory, if you like, that we talked about last week, is the cross-case comparison. That's what we're trying to do there. So some narrative analysts will say, no, you should be focusing on the one person and focusing particularly on the kind of discursive aspects of what they're doing. But not everyone agrees with that. And there are other narrative theorists who are quite happy, in fact, as Lieblich et al. Suggest here, if you're doing that kind of looking at that kind of narrative, why can't you do a thematic analysis and look at the themes across a number of different people that you might interview and compare those themes?
So, for example, if I was going to use a thematic analysis, when I'm making my justification on my case for using that analysis, I'd have to link them both together to say that I'm using a narrative approach, using the stages from a thematic analysis. I'd have to link them together.
If you want to, yes, you can. I think you can do that. I think you can essentially, do a thematic analysis. So you're trying to get large themes that come up across different cases, but at the same time pay attention to the narrative elements of what's going on, which might be small-scale narratives within the themes. There might be a narrative approach, or it might be a larger narrative which itself has important themes of change and success and so on that come out, which we want to compare with other narratives. And what's interesting, I find, when reading some of this stuff is, and I suppose this might be controversial, is that the people who do take a very individualistic version of narrative theory, so look just at one person's narrative and don't compare it with other people's, or at least they shouldn't be comparing, often actually do. They'll talk about that person, then compare that with somebody else's narrative, compare it with somebody else's narrative. Once you start doing that, it seems to me that's a thematic approach. You're comparing what they're doing with what they're doing and so on. And a lot of the narrative books you'll read, Cortazzi, for example, talking about educational narratives in schools, about teachers and so on, does a lot of that comparative approach, looking at lots of different narratives and the different ways in which teachers and school children talk about their education experience. So it is a very, almost in the end, a thematic approach that's coming out, but very much informed by the idea of the narrative and some of the structure I'll talk about later on, about the nature of a story itself. So I'll come on to that bit. I can't really illustrate it, so just bear with me and I'll come on to those things. In fact, here it is already. This is it. This is a part of it. You can analyse stories, complete life stories, in these kinds of almost classic terms. So this almost comes from, I suppose you could say it's from Greek writings about literature. And these four major forms of story are often found. In fact, the first two, I think, probably tend to occur more often. Maybe number three as well to some extent. The last one is quite unusual. But what do they mean by these things? Well, first of all, the romance is a story which is set up with a hero or heroine, the person, normally the person who's telling the story, who faces a series of challenges, as things happen to them, which are challenging, en route to their goal and eventual victory. They overcome things. And you get typical examples of this are people who have a serious illness and then talk about how they fought the illness. Notice the choice of term here, the fight against the illness. That's a very common thing in illnesses. And eventually overcome it, succeed, they get better, and then now back into life again. And there are measures of how that success, they got back to a job, or they've now had children, or whatever. However they talk about the eventual victory is coming off. And that's called the romance story, if you like. That's the story of a hero facing challenges, overcoming and winning in the end. Then there's the comedy approach, the comedy story. It doesn't mean a joke, doesn't mean it's funny necessarily. Comedy essentially is where the goal is the restoration of social order, and the hero has the requisite skills to overcome the hazards that threaten that order. So it's something wider than just the individual, something that's going on, which might be the person's family, it might be the work situation they're in, something like that, but where their activities bring that social order back to an even keel. It's being threatened by something. Perhaps they're talking about the company they work for is being taken over, an aggressive takeover bid by some other company. And they are telling the story about how their activities within that try to adjust things within the company. And it may end up with the takeover, but there'll be some kind of reordering of things at the end of the story that comes out of that. Not necessarily a victory, hasn't seen as victory as such, but rather a satisfactory solution for those involved. The tragedy is almost the opposite of the romance. Here the hero is defeated by the forces of evil and ostracised from society. But you have to take that in a kind of metaphorical sense. Here the person is overcome by things. This is the defeated person, the person who's experienced this, that and the other, and they've been hard done by, they've never succeeded, they haven't got the benefits that they should come to them and so on. And they end up maybe not being literally ostracised, thrown out of society necessarily, but sort of certainly metaphorically so. They're excluded in some way. They don't get the benefits that are due to them or that ought to come to a citizen and so on. So it's a tragic outcome. And then finally there's the satire, a cynical perspective on social hegemony, the idea of kind of almost setting yourself outside society and saying, looking back on it and seeing the ridiculous nature of how people are, and the kind of hegemony, the kind of general social norms which they are following, and again, a kind of outsider's view of how odd that might seem. So a different kind of story. Quite an unusual story, I think, for many people. As I say, the most common ones tend to be the romance and the comedy, and perhaps the tragedy as well. Now, there can be other ways of doing this. You can talk about whether a story ascends and descends, and whether it gets to ascending, getting to better things, or descending or regressing to getting to worse things. And a lot of stories tend to kind of regress to begin with and then ascend, and that's a typical format. You know, things get bad, something happens to me, things get bad, I have to struggle, God, it was awful, and then I did so-and-so, or then so-and-so happened, and suddenly you're back onto a progressive advance, and things are getting better. And sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes it's a stable kind of plot. Nothing really happening. It's just everything is fine and nothing terribly, either advancing or regressing in the story. A lot of stories I've come across tend to be this kind of format, I have to say, tend to be a combination of advancing and regressing. You could say the tragedy often is a story that starts out, sorry, not the tragedy, the romance, I mean, is a story that starts out with a dip from a situation down to some kind of awful crisis, and then a recovery from that. Usually a recovery is brought about by the person themselves, something they did, something they've done that changed things and brought them back to success again. Okay, so that's the second category. That's looking at the whole story, but looking at the formal structure of the story, how the structure is formed. Now we come to the categories, the parts of stories, and talk about either the categorical content, which is essentially a kind of content analysis, or even a thematic analysis. Fairly simple, can be simply a matter of counting and cross-tabulating if you're doing it numerically. Nothing terribly exciting about that, and I'm not going to say much more about that. Number 3. Number 4 talks much more about again, not the content, but the structures, how people are doing things. And this is really getting on to the discursive approaches in narrative analysis. So looking at the discrete linguistic usages, the stylisms, the characterizations and so on, the metaphors used, whether the words are passive or active and so on. And Lieblich et al. Suggest a whole range of these things that you can do. You can either look at particular words and do that, or take a kind of more sort of discursive approach towards how the words are being used. But the important point is to see in detail how people tell the story through the words and metaphors and similes and so on that they're using. So you can, for example, look at adverbs, to see, again, what use they're being made of what use is being made of them in the story. Words like suddenly indicating unexpectedness of events and so on. Mental verbs, again, people have done this, gone through looking for any section where people say, I thought, I understood, I noticed, and so on, where they're talking about, they're thinking about things, they're reflecting upon what they've experienced. Again, this can be an expression of whether people are conscious and, forcibly kind of emphasise the fact they're conscious of this and this is what happened at the time, I knew it was happening, that kind of thing. You can look at denotations of time and place as an attempt to either distance an event or bring it closer. In fact, sometimes it can be a bit of both together, but very often it's a way of distancing things from where we are now. It was some time ago. You give a date to it and time to it and so on. Use of the tense is interesting. I have to say most stories tend to be in the past tense. When people are answering questions in interviews, they often talk about things in the present tense. I do this, I am doing this now, or whatever, continuous present or just present tense. And then they'll break into the past tense for a story. That reminds me when so-and-so happened, past tense. So-and-so did this and did that, etc. All past tense now. And that's often a clue that a story is being told. But people can use it more constructively as well, and use the transition between the past, how I was then, and the present, how I am now. And that might be an indication that comes out from those changes. Transition between first person, second person, and third person voice. Is it me doing it, or is it being done to me, or being done by them, and so on. And ideas of agency in passive and active verbs. Is it things that I achieve, or is it things that are done to me that are going on here? Okay, I'll zip through these quite quickly, I think, because I hope you're getting an idea now of the kind of the focus on the small level of use of language. Breaking chronicle flow, another way of doing it. Regressions, leaps in time. Again, it's sometimes interesting to look at when people don't tell the story straight, when they diverge, and you'll see some examples of that later on. When think, why are they diverging? What's important about not telling that story but going on to this one instead? It might just simply be the speaker has thought of it, but it might be something else that's going on. Repetition, clearly important. The more people repeat things, the more they want to remember them, so therefore they must be important. So repetition is quite an interesting clue about how important something is for somebody, whether that's just simply in answering questions or in telling a story, in repeating parts of the story, but the repetition itself does say something. There must be a reason why people are repeating themselves. Detailed description, again, we saw this actually in the line-by-line coding, what we thought might have been reluctance to talk about certain issues by getting into description of something else, avoiding the topic, and detailed description is often a way of doing that. Now, how do you do all of this? Well, again, it's detailed looking at the text, and you go through underlining the words, finding where these things occur, and then thinking about them once you've found them, what's going on here. And so it's a simple matter of a very close examination of the text, not the kind of thing you can spend, do with a large amount of text. You tend to focus on small sections of text and do this kind of fine, detailed analysis on. But it does give you an insight into, how the person is using their terminology to tell their story and what's behind that. Okay. Turning to a different way of approaching this, Reisman talks about the structure of narrative as a way of analysing narratives, and looking at, partly as we have done already, looking at how the story is organised, the romance, the tragedy, the satire, those kinds of things, the upwards and downwards movement of the story. Looking at how the tale is developed, in particular what the events are, what actors come into the scene and so on, what they do, and how and where it begins and ends, and why it's ending. And we do this to answer these kinds of questions, to ask how people give shape to events, how do they understand the things that happen to them, how do they portray them, and so that gives you an idea of what they think about them, what it means to them. How do they make a point, and why do they make a point, why do they use that? It suggests, making a point suggests there's something important in their narrative that needs to be brought out. And of course how they package the narrated events, how they portray them, how they describe them, how they identify them, and so on. And of course their reactions to them. And how they articulate narratives for the audience, a most important point here, because narratives are not told to one person, they're told to you don't tell the narrative to yourself, you tell the narrative to somebody else. Often a rehearsed narrative as well, would be a thing you've told before. Maybe not in the particular form it takes and the detail it takes, but elements of it would have been told before. So they are almost like a repertoire of stories that we have to bring to bear. And we bring those out to indicate some of these other things. Okay, I mentioned Cortazzi already as doing a lot of work on educational stories, but he uses this particular model to identify and then think about narratives. And I don't recommend this in every case. It's not something you can use all the time, but it is an interesting model. It does bring out some of the elements of what a narrative is like, and it can be a useful way of pulling apart a narrative to some extent. And it's based on Labov, American linguist, who first proposed it, looking at linguistic use. And it has these 6 structural elements. It's saying basically a story starts with an abstract, It then goes into an orientation phase, followed by a complication phase, then evaluation, then a result, and possibly a coda at the end. So it has 6 optional elements. The abstract and coda aren't always there, but the others tend to be. Let's look at what they mean. Okay, so here's the first element, the abstract. The abstract is telling you what the story is about. It's optional, it may not be there. In fact, sometimes the question from the interviewer is the abstract. They tell you what it's about, and the person then launches straight into the story as the answer. But the abstract gives some kind of summary of the general point the story is going to be about. You know, that reminds me about the time when, and so on, is a common abstract. But it can be, well, yes, of course, that doesn't always happen like that. You can find cases where so-and-so, a general statement, that's part of the abstract. And then the person will go on to tell the story that illustrates that general proposition. Okay, so the abstract is kind of almost a general summary of what the story is going to do. Then you have the orientation phase of the story where people will set up who's in it, who the actors are, who the people who are going to be present in the story are, the cast, if you like, when it happened, where it was happening, and so on. It's like when, they'll often say, well, that happened to me when, and so on, the when indicating they're going to tell you when it happened, or perhaps where it happened as well. And they'll usually tell you who was involved, what kinds of people are in the story. With them as well, usually, but not always. So we set the thing up. In a sense, we've now got the cast, we've got the scene. You know, think of it as a kind of theatre almost. We've got the abstract, which is the title, if you like. We know what it's about. We know what's happening on stage and who the actors are. What do they do? Well, that's where the complication happens. They start doing things, and things get complicated. Something happens. They do something in it. This is the bones of the story, in a sense. They may be doing something like this first, and then they change to this. And common things that crop up here are turning points, crises, and problems. You know, turning point is they're doing this, and then this happened, and they did this instead. A crisis, they tried this, it didn't work, so we had to do this instead, and then we did this. Or a problem, we tried all of that, and then we got a problem, and then we had to try and deal with that. We weren't very successful, we did this, and so on and so on. So various ways in which the situation gets complicated and the people respond to that in some way. Turning points is a very common one, where people experience something and as a result of having done or failed to do something, they suddenly realise they've got to do things differently. They've got to become a different person. They've got to have this kind of change of life. And then, having done that, the person will normally evaluate it. You know, what's the point of the story? What's it showing? And there'll normally be some content, some comment rather about that point. And then the result, what finally happened, the outcome. You know, did we all go home and live happily ever after, or what? So it meant that, you know, now we do it this way, or oh God, yes, that they all got sacked and we've got now new management structure, and that's much better than it was, and so on. So a kind of evaluation and result together. And then the coda might come at the end to kind of bring things back to the present time. And it might be so that's the story of so-and-so, or yeah, you can see now why I still feel so angry about so-and-so, or now you can understand why so-and-so did this. That kind of thing that brings it back to the present time and ends the story. Not always an optional section. Let's see, I think I've got an example of one of these. And the abstract is actually the interviewer's questions, or a question rather. So your family, kids came back here, and then Dave says, no, they're both working, and tells a story about the family basically. Our daughter was overseas, worked in Brisbane, son just worked in Brisbane, they're both up here. Then he has the complication. The difficulty I can see coming is they're both going to want to settle up there. The difficulty I can see is that no home care equivalent in Queensland, so even if we wanted to move closer to the kids, that it is simply not going to be possible. unless there's my wife is going to need help eventually, and it's just not going to be possible. Although Queensland is vastly definitely better than here. We came here because our children were already booked up in schools up here. So they were already booked in, and our daughter was in the second year, and so it had a university, and I wanted somewhere I could do a bit of study. So there's his complication. You can see what he's doing. He's telling the story about how he's now got this kind of conflict between what's good for the kids now, what's good for the kids later on, and where they want to be themselves. And then he says, so this town has worked out well. You can see he moved there because it was good for him at that stage. And then he says, but it looks like we're stuck in New South Wales, NSW. We can't head off. We can't move anywhere else now. He's stuck. And then the coda, you really do read horror stories about Queensland. The lowest funding for disability of any state in Australia doesn't say a lot. So obviously he's a bit upset about where he is now and wanting to move. So a kind of way of seeing into kind of what he's telling, what his story is, that gives you some insight, I think, into what he's feeling about the situation and the conflicts that are coming up with dealing with his children. So now we've looked at a lot of the analytics perspectives about how narrative is constructed. We've looked at the language that's used and the actual structure in terms of parts of a narrative. I want to turn my attention now to the functions of narratives, the functions of telling stories. Why do people do it? What are they trying to do when they're telling stories? And there's a variety of forms and functions, if you like, of stories. First of those, perhaps to look at, is the role of luck and planning. When people tell you a story, they're trying to emphasise that balance between the luck they had, or maybe the bad luck they had, and the degree to which their planning, their actions made a difference. And of course they'll look at this in terms of the effects of events on their life. So they're telling you, part of the function of telling a story is to tell you to what degree they are where they are now because of luck, or maybe bad luck, or the degree to which they are where they are now because they planned it that way, they worked towards it, they strived hard to get there, and so on. So the story is telling you about that balance of luck or bad luck and planning, and maybe to some extent telling you how much they have achieved by their actions in getting where they are now. Another quite different role or function of stories, rather than being told by people about themselves, this is a tale often told about other people, a cautionary tale about accidents and disasters, in order to illustrate what kind of things one ought to do. In that sense, then, it's the morality tale. Don't do this because if you do, this happens, or do it this way because that way you'll avoid this happening, and so on and so forth. Or I remember the time when so-and-so tried doing that and they ended up as a disaster, and so on. So it's a way of bringing experience from the past into the present as a way of helping people decide what to do, guiding their actions. Of course, one very common way this happens is in telling stories to children. Either telling children about other children that have done things wrongly and come a cropper, or perhaps the parent telling the child about what they did that was wrong when they were a child, and therefore is not to be repeated now. Again, a morality tale, if you like, in a story told to have that moral effect on the listener, the audience. That overlaps to some extent with a third function of stories, that of passing on a cultural heritage or an organisational culture, because in part these can be morality tales as well. And there's been a variety of different research uses of this, research into different areas of organisational culture. For example, widespread use of atrocity stories and morality fables in occupational settings and organisational settings has been noted. So people in their work will use these stories to tell others about things that have happened. And they can do it for a variety of functions, a variety of reasons, either to help others learn how to do things in their new job, or perhaps to warn people about the nature or the character of certain people in the organisation, certain managers or certain colleagues, who are to be avoided because this happened in the past, or this is to be done with them, or they're a good person to go to because they did this in the past, and so on. So a whole set of atrocity stories, things that went wrong, that were done badly or came out wrongly, and morality fables, the good and the bad, as to what people have done in the past, that help people learn about that occupation and that organisation. One common area for this is medical settings, and the particular form they take here is of fables of incompetence, about what this or that doctor or this or that nurse or this or that therapist did that was good or bad. Very often bad. They did this, it was wrong, and you shouldn't do that. Don't do things in this way because I remember when so-and-so did that, and he or she tried it and it just didn't work, and it ended up with patients being injured or perhaps even dying, and so on. So quite strong warnings about incompetence and how to avoid it for those either learning their medical or their nursing or therapy training, or those who are going into practice now and therefore, again, in a sense overlapping with the organisational settings, learning about how things are done in that organisation. And again, a third example of this is the oral culture of school children, the whole urban legends, urban myths kind of area that's created again and again by school children, the tales they tell each other, sometimes repeating ones that have been around 20, 30 years before, but sometimes entirely new stories, picked up in a variety of ways from other settings, sometimes made up by the children themselves, but passed on as a kind of oral culture, quite separate from the culture of their parents and the teachers and so on. Another set of functions of narratives and stories is to help people order their careers and memories into a set of chronicles, narrative chronicles, marked by key happenings. So, when you ask somebody about their life and ask them to tell you about who they are in their life and what identity they have and so on, they will use stories structured in these kind of periods or phases to tell you what they've done. And those key happenings will be the breaking points or the stopping points between the different chronicles or tales. They can take a variety of forms. It can be they moved somewhere else, or they left that job, or they split up with their partner. Something like that can be a key happening, or it might be some kind of turning point or some kind of epiphany in their story, where suddenly they realise something happens to them and they realise they've got to do something about this, or they realise that they're going down the wrong direction, they've got to change things, something of that kind. So the stories are often in parts and in sections with these kinds of key happenings, marking these important points throughout the story. And of course, for the people telling that story, that's a way they can emphasise how they want to be seen by the audience, by the listeners and so on. And to some extent, of course, how they want to see themselves is portrayed through their stories. Another function is the way of coming to terms with particularly sensitive or traumatic times or events. I've already mentioned the splitting up with the partner, the divorce story, but it can be a violent story, or it can be some other kind of traumatic event, particularly illnesses are a very common example of this, where people try to come to terms with things that they've experienced, perhaps a very bad accident, or perhaps some kind of terminal illness they're now going to have to come to terms with because they're soon going to die. Those kind of events, people will basically construct stories around what's happened here, and it may refer back to some of the points I mentioned earlier about things like, who's responsible, what role luck has in this, and so on. Things they may have done that would have changed things so it happened now, and so on, that either were or weren't their fault, depending how they want to portray it. So they're bringing in these variety of elements to try to show how they're feeling about the particular events, the traumas that they're experiencing, and so on. And of course, above all, and I've said this once or twice already, the story is a way of structuring to oneself, one's ideas of who one is, your own idea of self and self-identity. This can be quite a lot of psychological view, and stories can imitate life and present an inner reality to the outside world. So in that sense, through rehearsing these stories and telling to an audience and to others, you're actually constructing your own identity as you do that, and they shape your identity. You could say, in the extreme sense, we know or discover ourselves and reveal ourselves to others by the stories we tell. So stories are not just a matter of relating some kind of objective happenings to others. In this sense, they can be very much a subjective idea, which is done not only for the benefit of others, but for the benefit of oneself, to try to construct who I am, what kind of person I am. And that's done through narrating the events and accounts of one's life, or at least significant aspects of one's life. Yet further functions include things like justifying relationships. Again, this is, I suppose, this overlaps with the identity. Who I am, to some extent, might actually tell you, why I'm justified in this particular relationship. It might be an emotional relationship. It might be some kind of work relationship, the story will help justify why that's going on. So you could say another function of stories is to justify one's actions, to explain to others why you really had no choice about doing this, or why it was the best thing to do, or something of that kind. And of course, when you start to generalize that idea, you come to this point here that the stories show how the actor frames and makes sense of a particular set of experiences in the most general sense. I've mentioned some of these already, like the traumatic events happening to oneself, or the accidents and the morality tales that happen in occupational settings. So to generalise, we can say that the story kind of makes sense of experiences, measuring success, overcoming adversity, good and bad practice that one has in one's work or one's life, and explanations of success or failure, most generally, can be done here. To look in a bit more detail at that last point, the success and the moral tales. Tales, although very often very personal, can also be a kind of collective reminder of what not to do and how not to be, or perhaps sometimes how to be as well. Very often negative, but sometimes positive as well. So what I mean by this is not just that there's something that individuals have, but rather something individuals share. A story that gets told and retold by others about third parties and so on, or even told by one person and picked up by others and repeated as stories about them that emphasise these moral aspects and these guidelines to action and so on. A common theme of these kind of stories is overcoming difficulties and achievements of success. So the what not to do and how not to be comes along with some kind of achievement at the end. So no matter, all these kind of things went wrong, but there was some kind of success at the end. So a typical format for these will be some kind of challenge existing, the adversity of dealing with that, and the various aspects of how the person overcame those challenges, eventually leading them to some kind of success. And as I mentioned, I think earlier on, a key issue in these stories often is some kind of turning point or some kind of epiphany, some kind of recognition that things are now going to be different, either because the objective situation has changed, the actors in the story have changed, maybe they've gone somewhere else and no longer acting, or because the teller, the narrator, has realised that something is happening, that something about themselves they recognise, and they decide from that point onward to do something different. And of course, as a social scientist analysing these stories, you can use these stories as a starting point for further explanation in the analysis, that having got some idea about what the person thinks, or what perhaps the culture is in the organisation or the group you're investigating, the setting you're investigating, you can use the stories told there as starting points for further exploration, so that you can use them and say, well, okay, you told me the story about so-and-so, so does that mean so-and-so? What do you do if, and has that changed, and so on. So a whole lot of questions can come out of that for further investigation in qualitative analysis. One further function, which is quite an important one as well, particularly in an organisational context, is the narrative as a chronicle. It's a form of autobiography, people telling stories about themselves. And this often has particular forms. It is the how it happened, or how I came to be where I am today story. And people organise their lives through this story and make sense of them to themselves and, of course, and to others. One important issue here is the notion of career, the idea of having a career, which can be an occupational career, or it can be other social roles like being a parent or being a patient, or possibly even being a child, children telling stories about themselves. And the idea here is that there's some core aspect of that person, which is the career they're following. They are a parent, or they are a teacher, or they are a nurse. These are very common areas where stories get told, and people's whole sense of who they are is centred around that career. Less so for certain other careers, but you might think, even in commerce, things like the entrepreneur, the story they would tell about themselves would be very much this kind of career story, how it happened, how I came to be where I am today. And I need to tell you more about the kind of the nature of entrepreneurial stories, that they often end up with, how I got to where I am today kind of format. Now, I want to finish these comments about stories by turning my attention to a few criticisms of narrative. I've talked very much about the positive so far, the ways in which narratives and stories are used by people to structure events, to understand things, to interpret the world, and of course to come to understand both themselves and to portray themselves to others and give themselves certain identities and so on. But they don't always work that well, and sometimes they can be a bit misleading. And a couple of critiques from the literature here. The first of those comes from Berry, who questions the motivation for stories. Why are people telling you the story? And in many cases, he says, what may look like an attempt to look competent is simply a cover, and particularly in the illness narratives of coping. People may be telling you they coped in an attempt to try to portray themselves as competent rather than just coping. So giving some kind of ideological expression to how things are rather than how they deeply feel themselves. They may feel obliged to give some kind of account in which they appear competent, even though they don't feel like that at all. So the stories they tell are not just simply an externalization of some internal feeling or internal concept, but may be deeply influenced by the settings in which people are working. And if that's in a setting where expectations are that they should be able to cope, then they may tell the story that makes it look that way, even if they don't feel it themselves. The second criticism I want to look at comes from work by Rhodes and Brown in organisations. And they looked at the use of narratives as reflecting particular political ideologies in their organisations. For example, you might find narratives from management differ from narratives given by workers or the unions and so on, or maybe different parts of the company, different departments or international parts of the company compared with national parts, have different kind of ideologies about what they're doing, and the stories they tell reflect those different ideologies, which is very interesting and tells you a lot about how those ideologies are working and the kinds of ways that people think about what they're doing. But sometimes, say Rhodes and Brown, we need to offer as I said here, reasons, causes and accounts, and to make judgments about what's going on. We're evaluating some program in that organisation, for example. We may be less interested in the kind of stories that people are telling, or more interested about what's actually happening and what causes those things to happen and so on. And so we have to take some kind of much more objective idea about the activities. And the stories in that sense are less useful to us in what we're trying to find out about. So narratives then can be very useful in revealing things about what's going on, but they have their limitations, at least in these respects. And we have to be careful about the degree to which stories are being passed off as something which they're not. And in the case of, say, illness narratives, we have to be careful about their reflecting different ideologies rather than real differences in the way that companies operate.